We typically think, on the one hand, of gold as the ultimate financial instrument, as what you buy things with. And I remember somebody once asking me, as I was giving a lecture about building giant monuments like the pyramids and the obelisks, and somebody asked me, well, how much gold did they have to spend to buy an obelisk? And I said, that's not really how it worked. When we looked at the way the pharaohs used gold, it wasn't so much as a financial instrument, but as a political instrument, something that they didn't buy things as they bought people, whether it was their Egyptian elite, their soldiers, even the gods themselves, and foreign kings. Now, this year is also the 100th anniversary of the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb in November of 1922, discovered, of course, by the English Egyptologist Howard Carter, that was sponsored by Lord Carnarvon, who, among other claims to fame, is that he owned the castle where they filmed Downton Abbey. Now, of course, Tutankhamun's tomb was perhaps the most spectacular example of gold that has come down to us from ancient Egypt, especially since so many of the other royal tombs were utterly robbed. One thing to say about Tutankhamun's tomb is that we often remember Howard Carter, but just as important to his work were the Egyptians who worked with him, the archaeological excavators, and all the Egyptian officials that worked in helping Carter to actually excavate the tomb, and of course, bringing the treasures of Tutankhamun to the museum in Cairo. And in fact, the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb was a turning point in modern Egyptian nationalism. Now, when we think back 100 years ago to when Tutankhamun's tomb was discovered in the days before color photography, we see these wonderful black and white photos that were made by Harry Burton from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and just wonder what it must have been like. One of the marvelous things that we now can look at through digital technology is some recent work to colorize these black and white photos of the objects as they sat in Tutankhamun's tomb. And it brings to mind the famous words when Carnarvon asked Howard Carter, as he first glanced through the small hole into the doorway into Tutankhamun's tomb, and he was presented with this view here. And he asked, well, what do you see? And he said, wonderful things. And that's all he could manage to say. Now, the purpose, again, of gold in ancient Egypt was not so much as a financial instrument, but as a means for the pharaoh to enhance his authority, his influence over the elite of Egypt, over the kings of the ancient world, and even with the gods of Egypt itself, as well as being a means by which he increased his own status and prestige, as we can see with King Tutankhamun becoming the kings of bling, of essentially being gold-plated pharaohs of the ancient world. So I would like to examine the constituencies, the people and gods who the pharaoh lavished his gold on, but also the way the pharaoh controlled access to gold. Now, the way that the Egyptians acquired this gold was through dozens, if not hundreds, of individual mines that they opened up in the eastern desert of Egypt, in the southern part of Egypt, which they often called the gold of Coptos, as well as the gold both lying in the alluvial gold that they would pan the way you used to pan for gold in a river, in the alluvial gold in the Nile Valley in Nubia, but as well as the gold in the desert valleys of ancient Kush, which they called the gold of Kush. And the places where they went to get the gold were often the most inhospitable places imaginable, in the barren deserts. And the challenge was keeping people alive and getting the water that was necessary to actually mine the gold, not simply to give water to the men and women and children even that labored in the mines, as well as the animals that would have to bear their burdens, like the donkeys. And we have these evocative texts, such as a text from the time of Ramses II, where he talks that reports had come that whenever they would send men and donkeys to mine gold in the remote deserts of Nubia, that half the men and the donkeys would die through lack of water. And he promised to dig wells to be able to ensure that the men who went to the mines and all their animals and the people that came with them would actually have enough water to live. The darker side of the prospecting for gold in the ancient world, especially in Egypt, is the harsh conditions in which people work to produce this beautiful, precious substance. And again, we have reports from a Roman author that describes the gold mining operations in the Eastern Desert in the days of the Roman Empire. But these were not unlike the conditions under the pharaohs, such as the pharaohs of the New Kingdom, even the gold that was produced to decorate Tutankhamun's tomb. And it was a lot of hard work in extremely difficult, dry conditions in the remote desert. The gold occurs in these natural bands or veins that run through quartz, a fairly hard stone. And to get it from the desert, you had to hack away at the mines and bring out these nuggets that came from these nodules of quartz. And to separate the gold from the quartz, it all had to be crushed. And there were men and women that broke it into small pieces. And then people would actually grind it very much like grain is ground to make flour for bread. This is an Old Kingdom model of a woman grinding grain. But in fact, this is also the method that was used to grind the gold bearing quartz into powder so that it could be washed and the gold flecks could be separated from the crystals of quartz. And this was very hard, backbreaking work. It also required a lot of water in places where there was no natural water, that it had to be obtained from wells. This is a gold washing sluice where the gold and the quartz was washed down. The gold would settle out in the rampway and the sandy quartz would collect in a basin. And most of the water that was used in the gold mining operations was never to quench the thirst of the people who were doing this awful work in the blazing sun, but actually to free the gold from the quartz grains that it was attached to. Now, the gold that came from Kush was a major source of gold, especially during the Egyptian New Kingdom. And this is a scene reproduced in an early 19th century copy of the highest official in ancient Nubia, the viceroy of Kush, a man named Hui, who served in the reign of the famous Pharaoh Tutankhamun. And this actually shows Nubian dignitaries bringing the very gold that made the objects that came into the tomb of Tutankhamun. So you see there various Nubian colonial dignitaries that are bringing platters with gold rings. And this is an actual gold ring here, now in the Metropolitan Museum of New York, that shows these ring-shaped ingots in which the gold was manufactured. But they also would bring gold powder and gold nuggets that were brought in sacks. And you can see the officials offering up all the gold that they managed to produce from the lands of Kush during the New Kingdom. Now, once the gold came to Egypt, it was brought into the royal treasury, what was known as the House of Gold and Silver, and then it was distributed to the craftsmen in the workshops. And the production and manufacture and storage and distribution of all this gold was not to make coins, but to make all kinds of luxury goods, beautiful jewelry, gilded objects and statues that would then be used to decorate the pharaoh and his court, and then be distributed to the various people and even the gods themselves that he wished to win his favor through his generous donations of gold and other luxury goods. And here we see a scene below of workers from just before the time of Tutankhamun making all kinds of gold and gilded objects in the workshop. And the upper two scenes come from the Pyramid Age, from the 5th dynasty, and show workers that are measuring gold ingots. And here we have a group of men who are using blowpipes in a crucible to smelt the gold so that it can be then made into various objects. Now, when we look at gold in Egyptian culture, in the ideology and the religious beliefs, they actually had several words for different types of gold. The most common and most famous is the yellow gold, which the Egyptians called Nebu, and which they often describe in evocative poetry, describing the flesh of the gods and sometimes of the king, that gold was the flesh of the gods. And we have these evocative descriptions of the sun god that say that his bones are made of silver and his bones are iron, but that his flesh is made of gold. And here we see a gilded image of the goddess of Memphis, the goddess Sekhmet, the wife of the god Ptah, in a statuette from Tutankhamun's tomb. And here we see a panel from a shrine that surrounded King Tut's coffin that shows the king as a form of the sun god and interacting with the god Osiris and the goddess Isis, and all overlaid in gold, conveying this idea that the gods themselves are made of gold. Now, another form of gold that was common in Egypt that had a different name was what they called Djamu. Djamu corresponds to a natural alloy of gold and silver known as electrum. And very often gold does not form of metal, but is actually naturally alloyed with various kinds of other metals, including a certain amount of silver, which produces this sort of platinum or white gold that was known as electrum. Or sometimes it will have trace amounts of copper and also of iron, and as well as platinum. Now, the Egyptians, especially in the later 18th dynasty, as we know from objects from Tutankhamun's tomb, they actually sometimes had red gold. And this was the result of alloying gold with copper or sometimes with trace amounts of iron, which produced this rusty color that was a reddish gold. Now, to us, it perhaps looks like a tarnished penny, but for the Egyptians, they actually prized this red gold, red being a color that actually had solar implications, such as this image of the name of Tutankhamun in the form of a winged beetle that represents the morning form of the sun god, or this image of a mirror case that shows the god of eternity. And in fact, if the gold was not naturally red, they could actually add copper or iron to produce this reddish effect when desired. Now, much of the gold would have went into the pharaoh's own palace, what would eventually be buried in his tomb, but he also distributed large amounts of gold objects and gold trinkets to the high officials and to his soldiers of his army. And there were two forms of reward ceremonies that are known from the Egyptian pharaonic period. One is the gold of praise, the gold of honor, that was given to high officials, elite courtiers, as a demonstration of the king's appreciation of their loyalty, and perhaps even as a way of buying the loyalty of the elite by showering them with golden gifts. And we see here an image of the general Horemheb, who will eventually become Pharaoh himself shortly after Tutankhamun's death. And during the reign of Tutankhamun, he was the highest general, but also a vizier, the senior prime minister of the pharaonic state. And here he is being awarded with multiple golden collars as a gift from the pharaoh to signal the pharaoh's appreciation of his services and of his loyalty. Other members of the court elite would have received various kinds of golden trinkets, whether in these elaborate reward ceremonies or even in the form of occasional gifts that were distributed by the pharaoh to the courtiers as a demonstration of their loyalty and of his appreciation. All kinds of objects. We have golden vessels, this beautiful chalice in the form of a lotus. This is a tool that was used for elite women to do the elaborate curls and braids in their hairdos. This is a beautiful golden wreath that may have sat on the forehead of a court lady. And this is a golden signet ring that would have been given to a high official, but it is inscribed with the name of the pharaoh Thutmose III. And this kind of gift, of course, would have been an advertisement that the official could demonstrate to his colleagues, showing that he's been given this reward, and it always would be stamped with the pharaoh's name as a reminder of who his patron was, and a way that very much like an autograph would allow him to show, look at me, I'm in the favor of the king, and there is his name on this golden ring that I wear on my finger. Here's another image of the time of Akhenaten, the father of Tutankhamun, and it shows Akhenaten and his wife, Queen Nefertiti, and their daughters standing on the balcony of royal appearances, a kind of high window, very much like the modern British monarchy stands on the balcony of Buckingham Palace. But here, the royal family is cascading golden collars and other gifts onto one of the highest officials of the land, a man named Ai, who is a chancellor, along with his wife, and in the presence of their various colleagues and members of the court elite, as the official is showered with all kinds of golden gifts. as a signal of the pharaoh's appreciation of his loyalty and demonstrating his favor over other courtiers, that Akhenaten is rewarding him with these gifts. Now, the more common form of these gifts that we often see in monumental art during the New Kingdom is a kind of golden collar made of these disc beads known as a shebu collar. And we have a couple of gold examples from later in Egyptian history to give us an idea. We also have images such as Horemheb here being rewarded with numerous gold collars, seemingly too many for him to actually be able to wear. And this was a symbol of just how much favor he had received. Now, another group that received the largesse of the pharaoh were his loyal soldiers, especially those who had distinguished themselves in battle. This is a relief of a common soldier, a man named Mos. So he was a rank and file soldier. He wasn't a general or a high officer, but he had been rewarded along with a group of other soldiers by Ramses II with various golden, also silver and bronze and copper gifts. And he commissioned a stela, a stone tablet, that records the moment in which the pharaoh had rewarded him and his military comrades. And it shows this very theatrical scene where instead of going onto the balcony of his palace, the pharaoh scrambles on top of the lap of one of his colossal statues, and there, using it as a balcony of appearance, showers the loyal soldiers with these golden and other metal gifts. And it talks about how the pharaoh was very pleased with Mos and therefore was rewarding him with these gifts. In fact, I wonder, this elaborate stone tablet that would have been carved by a sculptor, that perhaps Mos even used some of the gifts that he received from the pharaoh in order to buy the service of the sculptor who made this very impressive record of the pharaoh's rewarding of Mos. The ultimate symbol of bravery in battle that a loyal and victorious soldier might receive from the pharaoh, and we have this mentioned in some of the autobiographical texts, such as an admiral of the Egyptian Navy and a kind of marine, a man named Ahmose, son of Abana. And in his autobiographical statement, he talks about how he was repeatedly honored by various pharaohs of the early 18th and late 17th dynasty for his service in war. And one of the gifts that he was given were these golden flies. This is actually 3 of these golden flies that were found on the mummy of one of the late 17th dynasty royal women. And these aren't common house flies. They are in fact representations of horse flies. And for those of us that have been to Egypt and have seen these horrible horse or camel flies, or if you've experienced them in the woods, they're very persistent. They can be rather hard to kill, and they have a nasty bite. And I think these qualities are perhaps the ideal qualities of a soldier. And therefore, the fly, a golden fly, became the ultimate medal of honor for the brave soldiers the pharaoh rewarded with these medals of honor. Now, it was not just mortals who received the gold of the pharaohs. The gods themselves were given generous gifts. The pharaoh's job was to maintain universal order, or Ma'at. He did this in part by building temples to the gods, endowing them with rich offerings, and supplying the temples with all kinds of elaborate cultic paraphernalia, gilded and golden statues, various cultic implements like vases and vessels and offering stands and incense burners and ointment jars. And these kind of cultic implements and paraphernalia were often made from precious metals, but especially of gold. And this is an image of a scene from the walls of the temple of Ramses III, the 20th dynasty pharaoh, in his temple at Medinet Habu in western Thebes. And it shows the king presenting a series of cultic implements and decorations to the cult of the god Amun-Re, consisting of all kinds of golden collars that will adorn his cult statue, along with various ritual implements and paraphernalia and cultic vessels. And we know from descriptions in the monumental text of pharaohs such as Amenhotep III, King Tut's grandfather during the 18th dynasty, that the cult images of the gods themselves, their cultic statues and icons, were made of gold and other precious materials. In one dedication text, Amenhotep boasts that he had manufactured the images of the gods made of gold, electrum, silver, and of every costly and precious sort of gemstone. And these weren't diamonds and rubies and emeralds. They were instead what we call semi-precious stones, turquoise from the mines in Sinai, feldspar and carnelian, as well as lapis lazuli that was imported all the way originally from Afghanistan and would have come to the Egyptians through trade with the civilizations of Mesopotamia and the ancient Near East. Here we have a falcon-headed god, possibly the god Horus, and this is an actual cult statue. It's about a foot tall. It's made of electrum, but the face of the falcon has a skin of gold foil, and its eye markings and its hair have been inlaid with lapis lazuli. And this reflects descriptions of the gods themselves, such as Re, who is said to have bones of iron or silver and flesh of gold and electrum, with his hair being lapis lazuli. We also see this image of a gilded wooden falcon that was found in the tomb of Tutankhamun with gold foil, as well as this small gold statuette of the god Amun that is now in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. And to get an idea of just how much gold might be donated by various kings, during the 30-year reign of the pharaoh Ramses III, and he records on a papyrus that was created actually by his son after his death, Ramses IV, and it describes all of the gifts that Ramses III gave to the gods over the course of his 30 years on the throne. And if you just add up the numbers of the amounts of gold that he gave to the gods, he says that it was 3,648 deben, which is a unit of measurement that comes out to be about 732 pounds of gold, which just on March 2022 prices is almost $2.68 million. And this is just the bullion value of the gold in today's prices. Now, one of the more remarkable things that we hear in the monumental text of the New Kingdom period, and give us just an idea of how much gold was in circulation, is the fact that the Egyptians even used gold as a construction material. When Queen Hatshepsut, the 18th dynasty female pharaoh, dedicated 2 large obelisks made of single pieces of granite that were almost 95 feet tall and weighed several hundred tons, and that in itself is spectacular. But the dedication text that she inscribed in the base of one of these obelisks tells us that when she made these 2 obelisks, that she coated the upper halves of the obelisks with electrum, and that she describes pouring out bushels of golden nuggets as if it was bushels of wheat at harvest time. And this is just a very crude attempt to try to give even just a hint of what one of these obelisks might have looked like when it was coated with gold or electrum. And it must have been quite spectacular. And in fact, the dedication text also describes these huge obelisks as, quote, flooding the 2 banks of the river with light, like the horizon of the sun disk. And again, in the brilliant sun side of Egypt, these things must have been beacons radiating this reflection of the sun in this brilliant gold or electrum metal that plated the upper halves of these giant obelisks. Not to be undone, the pharaoh Amenhotep III describes in one building text from the Temple of Karnak that in the construction of just one of several temples he built in ancient Thebes, that he used the quantities of gold and electrum that amount to 3.2 tons of gold, that's tons, and 2.5 tons of electrum that were used simply in the decoration of the architecture of a single temple. He also tells us that the giant river barge of the god Amun, that must have been probably about 100 feet long, this huge vessel that it was plated to the waterline with golden panels and was a kind of golden floating temple. And of course, the texts describe it as gleaming and flashing, dazzling on the waters of the Nile as it reflected the golden rays of the sun. And it must have been quite spectacular. Beyond the gods and the people of Egypt, at least the court elite, gold was also central to the diplomacy of the pharaohs during the Amarna period and throughout the New Kingdom. But we have these remarkable letters from the time of the pharaohs Amenhotep III, Akhenaten, and Tutankhamun at the end of the 18th dynasty that describes the role of Egyptian gold in buying influence and favor and good relations with the various kings of the ancient Near East. In the time of Akhenaten and Amenhotep III, Egypt was a member of a kind of great powers club of the major kingdoms of the ancient Near East, including the Hittite Empire, the Empire of Mitanni, Assyria, and of course, ancient Babylonia. But the charter member of this great powers club was, of course, the pharaoh. And one of the things that made the pharaoh the center of this diplomatic system was the fact that he practically had a monopoly on the supply of gold, at least new gold, that was in circulation among the great kingdoms of the ancient world. And the pharaohs would give generous gifts of objects, of precious luxuries, but especially large quantities of gold that they would lavish on their fellow kings. And in fact, the other kings would, in often very undignified fashion, write to the pharaoh and practically beg for him to give them great quantities of gold. And one of the common cliches that turns up as a kind of buzz phrase in these letters is the claims that gold is like dust in Egypt, that one simply picks it up off the ground. And the kings of places like Babylon and Mitanni would beg the pharaoh for very much gold and say that it wouldn't cost him anything because the very streets of Egypt, it seemed, were paved with gold. And they were not too shy also about begging for large quantities of gold and reminding the pharaoh that in the past he had been quite generous. When the king of Mitanni, a man named Tushratta, who often claimed that he dearly loved his brother pharaoh, Amenhotep III and Akhenaten, he said, "May my brother," this is the way they would talk to each other to show that they had good relations. He would say, "May my brother, the pharaoh, give me more gold than he gave to my father. You sent much gold to my father. You sent golden jars and golden jugs and even bricks of gold as if they were only copper." Here you see some images of golden vessels that are shown in temple images of the kind of ceremonial vases and vessels that may have been made of gold and sent off as diplomatic gifts. Now, they could also complain when the gold that they received was not up to par, either in terms of its quantity or its quality. For instance, one time a king from Babylon complained that the gold that he received was not as advertised. They had actually melted it down in an oven to melt the gold. And what came out didn't look like gold, it looked more like silver. And I wonder if the foreign king had received a shipment of gold electrum and was expecting yellow gold and therefore was dissatisfied by its qualities. Now, after Amenhotep III died, the king of Mitanni, Tushratta, tried to have good relations with his successor, the pharaoh Akhenaten. And Tushratta was eager to tell the new pharaoh that his father had promised gold statues, but had never sent them before his untimely death. And of course, now Tushratta, to show that he had good relations, or to show that Pharaoh had good relations with him, was only too eager to remind the new pharaoh that his father had promised these gold statues. The problem is that they were late. And finally, when the statues arrived, were not actually solid gold statues, but wooden statues that were only golden plated. Now, these are two images of golden statues made of wood, but gilded with gold foil from the tomb of Tutankhamun. And I wouldn't complain if I received these as a present myself, but Tutankhamun was quite bitter that he didn't receive solid gold statues. And he went so far as to complain to the pharaoh's mother, the widow of Amenhotep III, Queen T, and wrote to remind her that her husband had promised these solid gold statues, but that her son had only sent gold-plated wooden ones. And he reminds her once again that gold is like dirt in Egypt. And why was her son not giving solid gold statues, but only these wooden plated ones? And he asked rhetorically, is this love? So we can see the uses of gold to buy the loyalty and the influence and favor of various constituencies, human and divine, the elites of Egypt and the foreign kings. And of course, this enhanced the king's status and his influence. But another way that he enhanced his status is by reserving much of the gold to make objects to grace himself, to decorate himself with golden regalia, as such as we see that was discovered in the tomb of Tutankhamun. Here is a golden head circlet, a diadem, that is the closest thing we have to a crown that a pharaoh wore. It's a circlet decorated on the forehead was the image of the cobra goddess and the vulture goddess. Among the objects that were buried on King Tut's mummy, layered between the bandages, were various objects, including this solid gold dagger with a golden sheath, elaborately engraved and decorated and inlaid with colored glass and stone inlays. Perhaps the most spectacular object to have come down to us from ancient Egypt is certainly of gold, is the one of the three coffins that enclosed the mummy of the pharaoh Tutankhamun. We're very familiar with his famous golden death mask. And of course, it traveled throughout the 1970s and 80s to various countries. And when we think of Tutankhamun's gold, this beautiful gold mask that weighs 22 pounds is very impressive. But even more impressive, I think, is the innermost of the three coffins that he was buried in. The two outer ones were made of wood and covered with gold foil and colored glass and stone inlays. But the innermost coffin was made of solid gold. In fact, when Howard Carter removed the middle coffin from the outer coffin and was surprised by how heavy it was, because of course he expected that all the coffins were made of wood. But when the lid of the second coffin was opened, Carter was dumbstruck to see that the innermost coffin was made of solid gold. And in fact, it weighed 243 pounds. That's 110 kilograms. And again, if one just imagines the bullion weight today, it is worth at least several $million. But of course, it is absolutely priceless. Now, the amazing thing I think about Tutankhamun's solid gold coffin, and perhaps something that we overlook when our eyes grow big at this vast amount of gold bullion before us, is the remarkable, magnificent workmanship of the artistry. The entire coffin is engraved with these beautiful, delicate images of these winged goddesses and feather patterns that grace the body of the king, as if he's enveloped in the falcon feathers of the goddesses Isis and Nephthys. And this is all engraved in fine, chaste work in gold, engraved with every filament of the feathers of the goddesses and of the feathered coating that coats the king's body. If this object were made of lead, it would still be a magnificent work of art. And the artistry that we see here would be spectacular. But of course, it is not made of lead or even aluminum or steel or even silver. It is made of pure gold. And so we are so dazzled by this amazing amount of gold that we perhaps often overlook just how fine the workmanship of this spectacular object is. Of course, when the golden coffin was opened with some difficulty that's described in detail in Howard Carter's account of the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb, he found inside the coffin the mummified remains of the king, complete with many gold trappings, and including the famous death mask. And here is the photograph, the black and white photograph that was taken at the time. And here you can see a color reconstruction of what Carter must have seen as he gazed on the golden mask of Tutankhamun for the first time. Now, in the bandages and in all kinds of boxes and nooks and crannies of the tomb of Tutankhamun, dozens of golden objects even hundreds of golden objects were found, including a whole series of golden collars, necklaces, and pendants, some of them placed in boxes, others layered between the wrappings of the mummy. And including these were these magnificent and gigantic golden collars in the form of vultures and cobras and broad collars with falcon head terminals, and even a golden falcon collar. And these are made of dozens of pieces of gold inlaid with colored glass and stones. And in fact, they're spectacular. They're very large. In fact, they could never be worn and were never worn by the king in his lifetime. They were made simply to drape over his mummy, protect his body in the form of the gods and goddesses, represented by these jewels, to protect the king's body for all eternity as he lay in his tomb and achieved his afterlife by unifying himself, by assimilating his person and his spirit with those of the gods Osiris and the god Re, the sun god. And so with that, I'd like to conclude a look at the way that the pharaohs used gold. And I'd also like to just put a plug in for some of my other work. I'm just about to publish, going through proofs of my upcoming book on the Pharaoh Ramses II, which will appear hopefully in the fall. And I'd also like to call attention to the website so you can learn more about the Hypostyle Hall project, as well as my Academia EDU page, where I have a number of my articles available for free PDF online. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention.